Start off, first of all, by talking about articles. Articles are obviously very important, so I thought I'd dedicate a lecture to how to keep up with the news, how to find articles, and how to make sure that you are informed. So we're going to go over 5 things in this lecture. The first is how to keep up with current events, how to keep up with the news in the world. You might already have your own method, but I'm going to give you a couple methods that work for me to keep up with current events so I can stay informed. The second thing is going over some good news sources. Good news sources not only to read maybe on a daily basis or even just on a weekly basis, but also good news sources to start to pull articles from to use for Extemp. Thirdly, creating your box, some things that you want to have, some information that you want to have before you get to a tournament. Fourthly, how to find articles and prep, and then finally just dealing real quick with the place of articles in an Extemp speech. So let's go ahead and start off with how to keep up with current events. These are some methods that I've learned over my 4 years that are really, really useful for me, and I like some of these because they're very customizable. You can focus on what you want to focus on or not. The first is Google News. Google News makes my life so much better. Google News is like the greatest thing that has ever existed on the face of the planet. Google News will give you a lot of information about most topics. Now, the way you can use Google News is you can do it a couple of ways. You can either just search something and then go to the News tab on your Google search bar, and that will pull up a bunch of news articles about it. And then once you go to, or you can search to go to actually Google News, and you can sort so it gives you a certain amount of information on certain types of topics. You can make sure it never gives you breaking news on sports, but that it gives you all breaking news on international politics. You can make sure that it gives you news on the environment or technology. You can focus the concentration of how many articles you get of different types of different sections, so you can cover a lot. You can also set notifications if there's significant movement on certain issues. Just real quick, I would definitely recommend, this has nothing to do with Extemp, but if you are competing in TP, this is a great thing to do for the resolution. Just set up notifications to alert you whenever there's a change on whatever topic the resolution is on. But with Extemp, you can do the same thing. So if there's a news issue that's really common, really current in the day, so say like right now, like tomorrow China bombed Japan and started like a war in Asia, you might want to set a notification for how stuff develops with that, so you can start to see and track the important parts, what changes within that reform. Finally, it also compiles many different sources. It's not like Google News sits there and publishes articles themselves. They compile articles from a lot of different sources, from some very credible sources as well. They compile sources from NPR, Reuters, New York Times, whatever news source you can think of. They probably have the ability to access those articles. I think you can also control what publications or what news sources show up most often in your Google News feed. So Google News is definitely a great way to stay informed on the news. However, just remember that it is Google deciding what articles you get to see or what articles you do not get to see. So don't rely primarily on this. But this is a great source for most instances. It's a great way to keep up with the news. The second thing I would recommend is smartphone apps. Sorry, Josh. For those of you guys who have smartphones, which I know are a lot of us, I can see several of them out. Some of us use them during lectures. If you have smartphones, there's a lot of great apps that you can download. There's a lot of great ways that you can keep up with the news on your phone. Download the apps of a few of your favorite news sources or follow them on social media. Actually, the main way I kept up with current events during the year was on my Facebook feed. I'd follow Economist, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Investors Business Daily, BBC. I had like 10 or 11 sources that I liked or followed on Facebook, and their articles would show up in my news feed, and I'd see them, I'd understand what was going on. If I found it interesting, I'd click on it. Another thing I do is I had downloaded, I think I had 5 apps through the year. I had the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, Washington Post for some reason, don't ask me why. And then I had a couple others. Those were just things that I could use to check it while I was on my smartphone, while I was just chilling around. If you're bored, open up your apps and just read an article or two. You don't have to spend like all of your time sitting there on your smartphone reading your articles like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't socialize right now. I have to look at my phone and read articles. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is if nothing's going on, if it's that thing where you'd usually flip up your phone, I don't know if any of you guys do this, but turn on your phone and stare at the screen for like 5 seconds like, I should be entertained by this. What should I do? In those moments, read an article or two in your smartphone apps or open up your Facebook feed, focus on those news sources, try to figure out some ways to keep up with events. Dang it. Set up breaking news notifications so you know when something big happens. Set up breaking news notifications so you get notifications on your phone, push notifications when something happens. You can even make them a little more specific than breaking news, like if you were interested in technology, you can get major news stories from technology on some apps, actually kind of like hand delivered to you on your notification, and then you can click on the notification. It will take you to specific articles. And it works out really well. Basically, all I'm trying to say is make sure you have ways to streamline and utilize the tools that you have on your smartphone to be able to keep up with current events. Thirdly, read the newspaper. Now, I know this sounds really old-fashioned, but reading the newspaper is actually one of the best ways to keep up with current events. It may seem outdated, but reading the real newspaper, the one that you actually have to hold, can be really helpful too. It can be really helpful to actually pick up a newspaper and skim through that newspaper, and it is so for a few reasons. A lot of the information is condensed down in a newspaper, meaning it's easier to get your overview. A lot of articles that are actually published in a newspaper are cut down from the size of the articles that they publish online. Why? Because they can take as much space as they want online, they can't take as much space as they want in the newspaper. They only have so much real estate, so they have to condense down some of the information, which makes it easier for you to get kind of an overview of what's going on. Also, they craft the newspaper, they build it together so that people would get a comprehensive overview just by reading the newspaper. Instead of dealing with hundreds of articles online, you have everything condensed down right there for you, and you can just say, oh, if I read this article, this article, this article, and this article under global affairs or whatever section it might be, then I'm going to get a general overview of what's happening right now. Also, a lot of news sources, I know the Wall Street Journal does this, I think USA Today does this, where they'll have just a little blurb, like a little side column on the side that says, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. It's just kind of a sentence filler, but it will kind of give you some indication as to what's going on, even if you don't have to read a whole article. So reading actual newspapers is really helpful. It can be easy to get distracted or overwhelmed when online. There's a couple of things with this. First of all, there is so much information when you are online. There are so many articles, so many different things, so many different communications. The pages are really busy. There's ads everywhere. There's all sorts of text. There's all sorts of stuff going on. Online news sources have their place, don't get me wrong, but they can also be really distracting, and they can also be really overwhelming. You might have too much information. We live in an era of the internet where you can have too much information, and too much information isn't always a good thing because it's hard for your mind to process it all, and it's hard for your mind to organize it all. If you have a newspaper, it, at least for me, will really help you to more effectively remember and keep up with current events. I'll talk about a newspaper that I would definitely recommend if you're thinking about this when I get to the good news sources section. Okay, the fourth one. Have news in the background. Who listens to music while they do school or something? Okay. Who listens to music while they do other stuff? Okay. Yeah, a lot of you guys listen to music, and a lot of us do that, A, because music is awesome, but B, because it's something that we can just have in the background that's kind of filling noise. At least for me, it just kind of fills noise while I'm doing stuff, and it makes me feel better about myself. What I would recommend to you guys is have a news channel playing sometimes on the TV on the background while you're working on other stuff. So replace maybe 10 to 20% of your music listening with just having a news channel on in the background. This will give you the ability to A, lose hope in the human race, but also B, have a great way to just kind of absorb information. This will allow your brain to slowly absorb the information being presented. I've actually found that for the most part, when I'm trying to remember something or when I'm trying to think through something, it's really helpful for me to have it on in the background so I'm not thinking about it, but my brain's kind of absorbing it. I might think through it, I might pique my interest if something really important comes up or something really interesting comes up. But for the most part, it's just kind of on in the background, you're listening to a few sentences, you're kind of getting an overview of what's going on. Yeah?
What's a good news TV channel to listen to, would you think?
I'll go over that in a second, because the answer is there aren't really many. It's the struggle. It's a real struggle. I'll get to that in the good news sources section though. That will be kind of there's going to be a good news sources section and then a good news sources section. It'll be in the second one. Okay, finally, don't listen to talk shows. When I'm saying have the news on in the background, what I am not saying is listen to talk shows, because talk shows are just people putting out opinions that are usually not based on anything except their political ideology. Exactly.
So not like NPR or something?
Probably not. I mean, some of them, there are some that do have some credibility to them. NPR is probably one of the only ones that has good talk shows. For the most part, though, talk shows are just people spewing their bias and trying to get people to accept their side. However, this is just a quick side note on having talk shows on. If you are on CNN and they have a conservative guest on a talk show and the conservative guest shuts up the talk show host, it is the most phenomenal thing on the face of the planet. It's like, I'll tell an example of that later when I get to the good news sources. Anyway, fifthly. What?
You're saving everything for that.
Yes, I am. That's like my favorite section. Okay, fifthly, do specific research. Once you hear something or see something, whether it's in the newspaper, whether you listen to it on a news channel, whether you actually listen to a talk show and they talk about it, or you see it on your smartphone app, you see it online, you see it on Google News, whatever that might be, if something piques your interest, if you find something that does that, do some specific research on it. Do some intentional research. Just type it into Google and try to find more articles about it. Try to find more information about it. For instance, this last year, there was some stuff going on with the European Union and whether or not they were going to have the 500 euro note persist. For some reason, I found that interesting. Because you don't often hear about whether or not certain types of currency should be perpetuated, whether or not they should keep having a certain bill. It would kind of be comparable to a discussion in the US about whether we should still have the $100 bill.
Or the penny.
Or the penny. Yeah, exactly. So that discussion was kind of interesting to me, so I did some research on it. I got some articles about it, I understood a little bit better about it, and then I happened to get a question about it in Camelback Classic Finals, and it made me so happy. But yeah, just research something that piques your interest, research something that you find really interesting, and find a way to expand the depth of your knowledge about it. Go deeper on what you think will be relevant in a speech. Don't get distracted by things that don't matter. Don't get distracted by things, that aren't going to be newsworthy, that probably aren't going to have questions about them, and if they do have questions about them, they are questions that you should not answer. For instance, if you're on the Wall Street Journal and there's this lovely article about how Major League Baseball is declining or whatever that might be, and that piques your interest, it would pique mine, and I would do an instant rebuttal of it. But if that piques your interest, you probably don't want to go deeper in that if you're trying to research for Extemp. If you're trying to work for Extemp, I would recommend not following things that probably aren't going to be in an actual question. However, if you're not really doing Extemp and you still want to follow that, go ahead, because that's cool. I went on so many bunny trails. I just would start researching stuff, and then I'd go down the line, and then I'd end up on some random article, and I'd be like, oh wait, how did I get here again? I have a friend who's notorious he started doing this in Extemp, and he keeps doing this to this day, where he'll just find random studies online and read them about the stupidest stuff. He read this study about the effects of cocaine on Japanese quails, and it was really, dude? Do that if you find it interesting, but don't do stuff like that to try to get Extemp speeches. Okay, so let's get to the good news sources. Some of these, again, are not going to be the best, but a lot of them I think are really, really interesting, and definitely really, really credible. The first one, and the most important one, is the Wall Street Journal. I talked about this a little bit, I think yesterday, probably talked about this a little bit Monday too, because I love the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is amazing. The Wall Street Journal is a business-focused magazine that provides analysis on everything newsworthy. Now, the Wall Street Journal, as you might imagine, started off dealing with Wall Street. It started off focusing on Wall Street, what was going on in economics, what was going on in business. But it started to expand its parameters, where now it will publish articles about just about everything that is newsworthy for Extemp. So it has articles about foreign affairs, articles about domestic affairs. All of these articles I think are really, really important and really, really helpful. The Wall Street Journal is the largest newspaper in circulation in the United States. It circulates, and this was in 2014, so I don't know what the number is now, but it circulates 2.4 million copies a day, which is 600,000 more than its closest competitor. So the Wall Street Journal is by far the largest newspaper in circulation, and that should be for a reason, because it is the best. If you're thinking about reading a newspaper, if you're thinking about having a newspaper, a hard copy newspaper to read, I would definitely recommend subscribing to the Wall Street Journal. I have for 3 years, and it's always the most interesting, the best newspaper that I read. Yeah.
Does Extemp Genie use articles from Wall Street Journal?
It does, yes. Does it? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a question I have about Extemp Genie. Like, just on the side note, do you know how Extemp Genie goes through all of these paywalls that most of the websites have?
I don't.
That's something I asked you.
The $25 that we pay a year helps with that a little.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. I'm sure in some way, either they've worked something out with the company, like a portion of our, actually probably a portion of our fee just goes to a subscription, a unique subscription, and they just download articles from there.
Or they're just like hackers.
So it could be
The Wall
too.
Street Journal app that you had mentioned earlier.
Yes.
Is there just a fee for that rather than getting the hard copy newspaper?
For the Wall Street Journal, for online newspaper or the smartphone app, whatever it is, you have to pay a subscription fee.
Right.
It's not exorbitant or anything.
Yeah.
If you pay that subscription fee, you can read infinite amount of articles online. You get the newspaper if you want it, and you can access the smartphone app.
Okay.
So there's not one specific charge, but it's kind of laid out across that.
Yeah, Izzy was trying to find something on the way here. I said, you have to pay a subscription. They're not just going to give you free information. I mean,
Right.
That's how
Yeah,
that's
and-
their livelihood, but.
And I think sometimes they'll give you like part of an article free, or they'll
Yeah.
give you a couple articles free or something like that.
And if you want to
so
read
you-
more, then you can subscribe.
Yeah, you don't need the subscription necessarily, but I would definitely recommend, if you're going to subscribe to any news source, subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, because that will give you the most information and the best information. And part of the reason that I say this is the Pew Research Center actually did a study on the most trustworthy sources, news sources in the United States. So what they did for this is they asked people of all different political ideologies whether or not they trusted, were neutral towards, or distrusted certain sources. So there was the consistently liberal, mostly liberal, neutral, mostly conservative, and consistently conservative. I think were the 5 different categories. Now they did this study with about 30 different news sources. The only source that was trusted by all 5 political ideological groups was the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is considered to be the most credible, the most balanced, and the most fair news source on the market today. One of the ways in which it does this, and I really appreciate this, is it makes it very, very clear if you're reading an editorial or an opinion piece. It differentiates those pieces from those that are actually considered news. The Wall Street Journal does the best with actually just giving you news, actually giving you the facts, actually what's giving you what is going on without putting some interpretation or spin on it. Now they put a little bit on it, of course. You kind of have to. When you're talking about something, the very way in which you describe that thing is going to illustrate some kind of spin. But it's really balanced. Sometimes it's going to be slightly liberal, sometimes it's going to be slightly conservative, but for the most part it's very neutral. So I definitely recommend the Wall Street Journal because all political ideological groups believe that it is a very trusted source. That does a couple things for you. A, that means that you should probably trust it, and you should trust it because it's an amazing source. B, that means that no matter what judges you get, all of your judges are going to have at least some respect or some positive affiliation to the Wall Street Journal. You're not going to be citing like The Blaze or something and getting a liberal grandma that comes in and she's like, oh, The Blaze is of the devil. And you're like, oh, okay, I'm sorry. The Wall Street Journal is going to be one that you can cite no matter who your judges are, no matter who's listening to your speech, no matter who you're talking to. There's pretty much going to be a lot of respect for the Wall Street Journal. Now, the Pew Research Center actually didn't think that the Wall Street Journal had the highest trust level or trust meter. It was slightly less trusted within those groups than maybe a couple of other ones. I'll get to those in a second, but the Wall Street Journal is the most balanced news source of all of them. Let's move on to the second one, Business Insider. Now, Business Insider is one of my favorites, and it is so for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Business Insider is a leading business and technology news source. It's one of the sources that I look to most when I'm trying to deal with domestic economic issues, domestic business issues. So if I'm trying to research stuff about the United States, about the way the U.S. economy works, I'm going to try to go to the Business Insider. Now, the Business Insider also provides articles about other things as well, about other types of things as well. Business Insider probably is going to be one of your most common with the Wall Street Journal, maybe Reuters, maybe New York Times. It's probably going to be one of your most common sources on Extemp Genie. Business Insider's on Extemp Genie as well. I think a couple of the next ones I'm about to talk about might not be. No, I think they are. Never mind.
Yeah, BBC is on there.
BBC Economist is on there. And
USA
IBD
Today.
isn't.
No.
I don't think USA Today is. Are they? They might be.
USA Today is on Extemp.
Okay. Well, a lot of these are, but a lot of this has nothing to do with Extemp Genie. It's all about making sure that you're reading them outside of round or outside of prep. So these are some to focus on still. But anyway, Business Insider covers a lot of things beyond just business, but it's one of the things that I rely on most for dealing with economic analysis. Wall Street Journal has good economic analysis too. I just like Business Insider as well. Also, Business Insider publishes really interesting articles just about random stuff that's really interesting. Like that Pew Research study I found, the only place I could find that online was on the Pew Research Center site and the Business Insider site. Actually, where I found it originally was on Business Insider, and Business Insider wasn't on there for a reason I'll talk about in a second. But it's a really interesting place to find really interesting articles. Now, the reason that the Business Insider was not on that Pew Research Center list is because it's not actually an autonomous news source. Here's what I mean by that. This site acts as an aggregator, bringing many articles from many different sources into one place. So it's kind of a similar concept to the Associated Press, where the Associated Press will pull some articles from other sources in and publish them under the guise of the Associated Press. It's a comparable thing here. They act as an aggregator, so they'll take some articles from other sources and publish them under the name of the Business Insider. What that means is you'll give a lot of variety in source, you'll also give a lot of variety in the perspective or bias that you're going to get. This will give you a lot of variety, and variety is good when you're trying to understand current events, because it will give you a lot of different perspectives, and those different perspectives can clarify your understanding of certain issues. Let's move on to the third ones. The third ones are BBC and The Economist. Now, I put them in the same class for a very specific reason. Both the BBC and The Economist are British news sources. Another couple that could fit into this category, if you want to make a quick note of this, would be The Guardian and maybe The Telegraph. But don't cite The Telegraph too much because it can be kind of weird sometimes. Kind of like, you guys know how The New York Times is just totally off sometimes. It's just kind of wacko. Telegraph is kind of like that, where half of its stuff is cool, half of its stuff just weird. But BBC Economist, maybe Guardian, maybe Telegraph, these are all British news sources. Now here's one of the reasons that I recommend British news sources. These sources often lack the agendas prevalent in the mainstream media when reporting on the US. I actually rely on the BBC and The Economist most for articles about the United States. For articles about domestic issues, for articles about the US, read BBC and The Economist, because usually they're not trying to prove some agenda for whatever political party they are associated with in their own country. Yes?
Plus, it's kind of fun to see how people in other countries are just viewing how everything
Yes.
in the US
Oh yeah,
goes
definitely.
on.
I love it. Like, I read an Australian news source a couple of weeks ago, and it was like, gun control. How the US is going to kill everyone in America with guns. And I was like, oh my gosh. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really hilarious to get different perspectives on it. But actually I found that most of the time for US issues it's very lacking of bias. A lot of the reason that we think things like CNN, things like Fox News in the United States are really biased is because they're tied to a specific ideology within their country. However, if they extend outside the country for international things, they're a little bit more credible. Same thing's true with the BBC and The Economist. And actually, according to the Pew Research Center, that's not the People's Republic of China for context. It's the Pew Research Center. These two are actually the two most trusted news sources in the United States. These were the two that ranked highest on the trust index, so to speak. They have the highest amount of people that trusted them as opposed to distrusting them. So these two sources have a lot of credibility in the United States. Especially The Economist has really, really good analysis pieces that can help you dive deeper.
So if those were the most trusted, like most number of people trusted them, but the Wall Street Journal was the only universally trusted, which ideology groups didn't trust BBC and The Economist?
If I remember, it was everything from consistently liberal to mostly conservative, trusted, and consistently conservative was neutral for both of these. So they're not going to be the most conservative news sources, but they're not going to be blazing and blasting you with liberal ideologies left and right. I'm actually going to show you guys
And right.
left and right. Oh my gosh, I see what I did there. I'm actually going to show you guys that study at the end because I thought it was just really interesting. So I'm going to put that up on the screen once I get to the end. Okay. Fourth, Investors Business Daily. Investors Business Daily was always one of my favorite to read. It wasn't necessarily my favorite to like keep up with current events or the thing that I thought was best, but it was oftentimes the one that I enjoyed reading articles from the most. Investors Business Daily is one of the only sources that focuses on international economics. Investors Business Daily is very, very focused on economics. So they will always focus on the markets, they'll always focus on industries, economies. Everything they publish usually has to do specifically with the economy. So this is really good for clarifying your understanding of economic issues. It's very neutral as most of it is used for people who are actually using IBD for business. IBD is used by a lot of stock traders for business, it's used by a lot of market analysts, and because of that, it's very professional in the way that it presents facts. It doesn't present them with some bent or interpretation to it. It tries to honestly give people information because it's trying to do so to help people with their actual livelihoods, their actual jobs, their actual professions. Yes?
During speech and debate season, how many hours a day did you read the news?
I would have, it wasn't necessarily like set in stone. There were a couple days where I'd probably just sit down and read it for like an hour and a half, just click through some articles, or I'd sit down and skim through the newspaper. Most of the time though, every day I just pull up my Facebook app, I'd scroll through, see stories. Even if I wasn't scrolling through Facebook for Extemp, I would still see some stories as I went through. I'd get some notifications on my smartphone. So a lot of it was setting up informal things that weren't necessarily like structured, that I could just get consistently integrated into my routine in a sense. But I would spend probably 2-3 hours a week specifically sitting down and reading news. It doesn't have to be like exorbitant or anything. And a lot of times I just did that because I liked it. I thought it was interesting, not because I thought it would help me with Extemp. Although it probably did, that wasn't the goal. Okay, one thing about IBD, the one warning, it can get a little technical and a little hard to get. They use some terms sometimes that, again, it's intended for people that are professional market analysts, people who deal with the stock market every day. A lot of times they can use phrases that are a little confusing for us common people to understand. So understand that. It can actually be really interesting because if you don't understand something, you can go do some research about that and understand that. Who knows, you might get an Extemp question about it someday. But for the most part, this is going to be really technical, so save some brain power for this one if you're going to read it. Finally, USA Today. USA Today is the only kind of mainstream source that I put on this list, and that's because I think it's the most credible. I'm kind of putting in the same class like ABC News, CBS, MSNBC, CNBC, Fox News, CNN, USA Today. All of those kind of mainstream US news outlets are all kind of in that category. In my opinion, USA Today is probably the best of all of those. The USA Today will give you some different perspectives to refine your understanding. The USA Today is a little liberal focused. It is focused towards a liberal perspective, so if you're going to get bias, it's probably going to be liberal bias. However, it is not to the point where it is indoctrinating. It is to the point where you can just think through it a little bit, refine your understanding by challenging your perspective. USA Today focuses on more domestic and international issues than economic issues. It doesn't really focus too much on economic issues. It doesn't focus too much on like the economy. If something is big in the economy, it will report about it. But for the most part, it focuses on domestic and international issues, which means that it's going to have a slightly different bent to the Wall Street Journal, IBD, or Business Insider. Pew Research Service listed as a more reasonable and balanced news source. It was one of the more balanced news sources. It was one of the ones that, again, there were some where there was maybe a little bit of liberal bias, but most conservatives would generally trust USA Today. Also, USA Today has a great sports page, so if you're interested in that, read that. Not for Extemp though, because that's not very productive. Okay. Don't. Here are things that you don't do. And this is not a hard and fast rule. I broke some of these rules. They're more like guidelines anyway. I broke some of these rules occasionally as I was going through reading, trying to understand current events. Don't go to mainstream outlets like Fox News or CNN. Obviously, this is not hard and fast because sometimes you're going to see Fox News, sometimes you're going to see CNN. For the most part, just stay away from them because the analysis they provide you is just bad. It's just awful. It's just like, here's my agenda, here are the facts, let's ignore that and go with that. So we're going to be over here in little agenda land and we're going to leave all that stuff, we're going to ignore all that stuff. For the most part, that's what seems to happen with Fox News, with CNN, with a couple other news sources as well. Just because your family or your extended family or your friends' parents might tell you, oh, Fox News is the bastion of news reporting just because they're conservative, does not mean that they actually are. So stay away from these mainstream outlets. Also, don't gravitate towards slanted websites even if they agree with you. A couple of instances of this are if you're conservative, The Blaze, if you're liberal, The Huffington Post. Stay away from these. They are slanted, so they're going to seem like better news sources because you agree with them. They're going to seem like better news sources because, oh yeah, another article blasting gun control regulation from The Blaze. Oh, what a great news source. It's going to seem like they're amazing news sources, but they are not because they are very, very slanted. These two types of sources were the most distrusted on the other side of the aisle, so to speak. So like The Blaze is the most distrusted liberal, the news source that is most distrusted by liberals. Huffington Post, also BuzzFeed, is the most distrusted news source by conservatives. Actually, BuzzFeed was ranked at the bottom. Who knew? I love that it was on there. Finally, don't just read one source. Don't only read one source. Don't just read the Wall Street Journal. Get a little variety, get a little different perspective. I'm going to show you guys that...
what are the stories that you were going to tell us? You were going to tell us some stories.
Yeah.
Some stories about what? I forget what stories I said I'd tell you. Okay, so here's the list. I don't know if you guys can see that or not. I'm going to zoom in a little bit because this is the 21st century. Okay, so if you guys see there on the left, ironically, consistently liberal. Then on the left here, it's total whether or not it's generally trusted or not generally trusted. So whether or not it's higher than, I think about 60% was the cutoff line. And then over here on the left, well, I find really interesting looking through this. It's just a side note. Look at how many news sources are trusted by those that are liberal, and look at how many are distrusted by those that are consistently conservative. So it's going to be very difficult to find, see these at the bottom. The Rush Limbaugh show is almost as distrusted as BuzzFeed. That should tell you something.
BuzzFeed, even liberals distrusted BuzzFeed.
That's very true. Yeah, but anyway, this is just really interesting. It's Business Insider article, most and least trusted news outlets in America. So if you're interested in reading that, definitely look at it. I just thought it was really interesting to kind of see the relationship between different news sources, whether or not they were trusted or whether or not they weren't.
What was that Business Insider that's so fast? What was the name of it?
Hold on, let me get back down to
Business Insider.
Okay, it's Business Insider, most and least trusted news outlets in America. Sorry. Sure. And that's citing a study by the Pew Research Center, which is one of the most credible, survey conducting organization thingies. That and Gallup polls are probably the two best. Okay.
Another question about that. So I know there's Gallup polls is in Extemp Genie and it downloads stuff, but have you ever found one?
Yes.
When you're searching through stuff?
I used Gallup all the time. You have to sometimes limit it to only search for Gallup. Especially with political elections, you'll get plenty of articles about it. There's plenty of polls out there. There's also polls about most domestic policies. So you just have to try to find it. If it's not there, don't stress about it. It's not a make or break source. Wall Street Journal might be a make or break source. The Economist, BBC, those are ones that your speech will be worse if you do not have them. It's not really that way with Gallup. It might be a little bit better if you do, but it's not that decisive.
Are you saying Pierre or Pure? You say it so fast.
Pew Research Center, like a church pew.
Pew.
P-E-W.
Got it.
Research Center. Sorry about that. I forget what story I was gonna tell.
How to do
researching. You were
Yeah.
what do you know? We just
Let's see if I can remember what I was going to talk about later. Story time is
You're not
fun.
getting distracted, get news sources.
Oh, yeah.
That.
Oh. Well, there are several that I could tell there.
maybe it was about a bunny chow?
Okay, there was one time I was researching about Ukraine.
Oh boy.
Okay? This is just an indication of what can happen to you if you're doing research and you're not disciplined, like I wasn't. I was researching Ukraine, right when Russia invaded Ukraine, tried to annex Crimea, all that stuff happened. All that bad stuff is still happening, we're still getting STEM questions about it. So I was just researching that. After a while, I started researching some stuff about Russia. And the Winter Olympic Games had just happened, and that came up. So I spent the next 7 hours watching replays of the Winter Olympic sports, and then realized I was doing Extemp. Yeah, don't be me. Be a little more focused. Be a little more disciplined than me. It's funny, a lot of these lectures are like, these are the things I wish I would have done for all 4 years. So don't be like me and not do them.
Did you watch the bobsled replays?
I did. Those are awesome. I also watched luge. I watched all the speed skating, like every single speed skating video, short track, all of them. Moguls is fun. I'm getting distracted again. Okay, just give me talking about the Olympics and I will never stop talking about them. So, baseball. It's not the Olympics. Rage! Okay.